So, in the first class this morning, we addressed the current landscape of discipleship, and then we biblically defined what a disciple should look like. Now we're going to talk a little bit about discipleship making. As I said, discipleship making doesn't just happen because someone shows up in church. I believe the call to go and make disciples indicates, that we are to be intentional about the process. I alluded to the fact this morning that I worked for the fire department. When I showed up that very first time, that very first day to the academy, I really, again, didn't have any knowledge about what I needed to do to be a firefighter. They spent the next 16 weeks teaching me, and then the next 21 years of my career developing the skills. And so it was an ongoing process. And it's amazing to me sometimes that the business world understands that there must be career paths, but the church, and we talked about this before, and I don't want to belabor it, we don't always have it clearly articulated how, or part of our fabric, our culture, how to move someone from point A to point B. And I'm not going to get into curriculum or programs, and I know that there's a lot out there with first base, second base, third base. But what I want to do today is just basically talk a little bit about some principles and that we need to think about when it comes time to develop disciples and discipleship making. I think oftentimes we lean way too much on programs, and it's not programs that makes disciples, it's people or disciples that make disciples. And so we can get too program oriented. So rooted into a church's culture must be a process for growing a person. Everybody should be able, now again, I'm not saying that our church has this down pat because we don't. But every person should have an idea of how the culture of the church grows people. And that's the only way that you'll get disciples involved in discipling others. A void text is created by a lack of intentional training that will lead members to frustration. Not only new members, but if there's or new converts, but members in general, if there's not a intentional training, it's going to lead to frustration, and more importantly, we're not going to accomplish the mission that God has set before us. And so a Barna research group research revealed that a church engaged in effective discipleship is a church that will steadily grow and be a solid church. We know the scriptures. I was thinking about this the other night. Pray to the Lord of harvest. As I started to think about that and just pondering a little bit, why weren't there laborers? There was probably, and you look at it from a discipleship perspective, if there's no new growth coming, then what are we doing? We're dying. If there's no laborers to go in the field, the problem is at the beginning of the process. We need to be able to develop disciples. And so when we talk about the importance of discipleship making, it first and foremost, it's what God has called us to do. But the only way that the church can survive, the church can survive, is if we continue to make disciples. And so, talk about the elements of making a disciple. There's basically, the two elements that I look at when we talk about the process of making disciples. First is equipping. And we talk about doing the training that we're doing right now. We talk about equipping. But here's something that I think sometimes we get stuck here. We are great at teaching, and we are great at instilling and transferring information. But the second part of making disciples is sending. Is to engage them in practical application. You can tell someone how to teach a Bible study. That's great. I can teach a class on how to teach a Bible study. It really doesn't sink in until I take that person to teach a Bible study with me. And so we are very good at teaching and instructing, and we like that. We talked about that in discipleship, but the other process is we really need to be involved in sending them and developing them, and sending needs to be part of the educational purpose. I told you earlier, when in the fire department, there was a didactics part, there was the classroom part, and there was the practical part. Putting the two, marrying the two together gave me an understanding of the skills that I needed to have to be able to be a firefighter. We need to do, when we look at making disciples, there needs to be as much practical time as there is classroom time. And that's something we often don't do. How can we accomplish that? Well, it's interesting. We're teaching a class, and I'm not teaching it, but one of our ministers is teaching a class on how to teach Bible studies. So we did first 4 or 5 classes didactic. And then we set up Bible study charts, sent them home with them, and they came back in, and guess what? They had to teach one another. And so there are ways to add the practical part into it. And we need to do that. Again, I divided these into 2 elements for teaching purposes. However, it's the maturity of one fruit. If we don't plan, when we talk about making disciples, if we don't plan to have a practical application, we're not gonna make solid disciples. We're gonna make, and again, you cannot mature in knowledge and not share the gospel. That's the other part of this. When we grow people, and part of maturity is as you're teaching them and they're becoming more like Christ, there should be, if they're really taking that in and it's really rooting into their system, it's going to be an automatic that they're going to have a desire to share the gospel. Is that right? I believe that's right. I believe that if they're becoming more like Christ, they should act like Christ. But then again, they also need to be shown. And we'll talk in just a little bit, but that's what Jesus did with his disciples. He took them, he taught them, he showed them, and so as they became like him, there was a natural part of that. So that's a natural part of being able to teach, but we also have to have the practical part of taking them out and showing them. So the $1,000 question is, how is this best achieved? Is it achieved through corporate instructions such as midweek Bible studies, or predominantly through small groups, or even personal Bible studies? How about this word that's now becoming a buzzword again, mentoring? Or is it a composite of all of these? I'm not here to tell you which one is best for you or which one is best for your church. But I want to take some time and just discuss or give you some points to consider when making disciples. Often we come to conferences like this and we're looking for a step-by-step process. Give me something that I can take home to my church and implement it there, and it'll work. Right? That's a shortcut. That's an easy way out. And so I don't have a step-by-step process, and I'm not going to provide one this afternoon. But I am going to give you a few concepts regarding disciple making that will apply at the corporate as well as the personal level. Often we falsely believe church services are sufficient to develop disciples. We talked about that earlier. While such services provide basic information, we need someone to mentor us for optimal development. And again, we spoke on that. Even Jesus disciples asked the Lord to explain the parables. So when we talked about that corporate world, then there's got to be an opportunity for them to ask someone to go a little deeper. And so, again, the disciples, there was a place away from the crowd, away from the large gatherings where they were able to ask for further instruction. And so when we start to have disciples, we have to have a place, or we need to have a place where they can actually come and begin, or have a structure that they know they can get involved in that will permit them to ask questions and to clarify things that they have learned. Especially, I had a friend that came in, and he came to church, and he ended up being discipled. I discipled him. One of the things that stuck out to me the most was as I was starting to disciple him, he had never been to church, never attended church in his life that I knew of. And one of the things that he struggled with is he just didn't even understand the apostolic nomenclature. So things that we said in church, he didn't even understand. And, we have our own language. And so it was kind of funny to me. He would come, we'd meet on a couple days a week, and he'd say, hey, what does that mean? Yeah. And what does this mean? And it struck me funny. I've got to admit, I'm born and raised in this thing. I'm going having, I'm going having church, doing my thing, and he's sitting in church. He's struggling to find out what's going on. Loves the atmosphere, loves the worship, but doesn't understand what's taking place. And he doesn't understand some of the things that we're talking about. And so the discipleship, making of a disciple, it started simply just us talking over the phone, meeting every once in a while. And but what it did show me, what will happen in large gatherings is it will expose the hungry. Yeah. And so I'm not against, again, the large gatherings of church services. They serve a purpose. But again, I've said it and I continue to say it. You can't disciple through inspiration. Right. Church services. You've got to spend some time developing them. And so within the intentional process to develop disciples, there must be opportunities to provide further explanation of concepts heard in the crowd. As I said, large training opportunities will expose the hungry, and we should utilize these opportunities to seek someone, or to seek someone that wants to be developed, that has a hunger. You see them in church. They'll come and they're kind of slightly assimilating in, if that's what you want to call it, and they're hungry, but they still look a little lost. And if they don't know where to go, and they don't know how to begin to have their questions answered, they're going to get a little frustrated. And again, I'm not here to tell you how to do it. Some may do it through personal Bible studies. Some may do it through getting them into a small groups. Someone may assign a mentor to them. There's a lot of different ways to do it, and we need to understand that there's no one way, but there must be a sensitivity when we're in a church service and the hungry are there, that we recognize that there is a hunger and we begin to respond to that hunger. Because if not, we know what happens when starvation takes place. Now that may seem a little dramatic, but we understand that the body begins to break down. Well, if someone comes into the church and they're hungry and they don't have an outlet to begin to find further instruction or have their questions answered, they're starting to break down spiritually because there's no answers for them. And the thing of it is that what will happen, and this might be a little harsh, but what will happen is they'll go somewhere else that has a program. Right? And that's one of the reasons I didn't come in today with just a program, because they can go to the church up the street, the church down the street from us. If they run 15,000, they got a program. But their program is, they got a program for everything but instilling the Word of God. So they make them feel comfortable for a while, and eventually what happens there is the hunger it either dissipates and they assimilate into that, or they stay hungry and continue to be frustrated. The program doesn't always achieve the results, and that's why we have to be careful, especially when we reach out to programs that we haven't prayed about, that we haven't developed for our churches. It's not always plug and play, is not always the best answer. It could, I don't know why I'm on that, I just felt the same thing. And so once the hungry is identified, what do we do with them then? And so Jesus identified 12 and he began to invest in them. As I said, if we are not prepared to feed the hungry, they will eventually become frustrated. And it's really not their fault. the church must have a plan in place. I don't know if it's written, but it has to be ingrained in the culture. And I think that this is, we're starting to see this. I mentioned it earlier. How do we close the back door? That's what everybody wants to know. How do we close the back door? How do we close the back door? Well, I think we close the back door by intentionally having opportunities to engage them and help them and walk alongside of them and disciple them. And so churches and ministry and leaderships, we often fear this transitional step. Quite honestly, there are some that are just not hungry. And we feel guilty. I'm one of them. I'm a pastor. I feel guilty. And I do not want to single out a person that's hungry for fear that there will be confrontation with those that aren't really hungry. There's a difference between somebody just, making a bunch of noise and somebody being, in desperate need of help.
That's right, there is. Amen.
There's a difference when your baby cries because they just want attention or they have a need.
Yes, that's right.
And sometimes the church, we as leaders in the church, we feel guilty. So what happens? We try to disciple everybody.
Yeah.
And we end up discipling no one. And so I understand that. So brother, sister, I've talked about it. When you stop a Bible study, that's a tremendous decision.
Yes.
Difficult decision. When do I turn this off? When do I stop this? He identified it as when they don't have faith. But again, if we're not careful, and the reason I wanted to talk about this is when we move them from, when we see the crowd and we see the hungry, and we can't disciple the crowd.
Right.
And going back to the fire service, there was 30 people in my training class. There were 3 instructors and 30 people. They taught me what they need, they taught me the things that they were supposed to teach me. But it really didn't start sinking in until I got to the station where there were 4 of us. And then they started reiterating what I was taught in the training academy. I'd never been in a fire until I went to the station. I'd been in pretend fires, mock fires, where they were in safe environments. I'd never been in an unsafe environment. And then there was additional questions that I was able to ask. And so again, one of the things that I think when we start to look at discipling is we need to make sure we're not trying to disciple a wide spectrum. And that's the starting place, but we need to begin to find the hungry and work with the hungry. And I think that that's one of the things that churches really struggle with, because we want everybody to be hungry, and that's just not the case. And if we're not careful, we will spin our wheels. And so that struggle is real. And we struggle to believe that there are those that, we struggle to believe there are those that are satisfied with the loaves and the fish. I don't know that came out right, but there are going to be those that follow Jesus simply for the loaves or the fish. Right. And so we look at those type of people and we think, oh, they want to be discipled. They want to be discipled. And I'm not saying don't pay attention to them. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not telling you not to give them opportunity. But here's the thing. You can focus all your time on them, and you will indeed hurt the ones that are hungry. And so in a discipleship program, we need to make sure that there is this type of instruction available to them. We can make the mistake, again, of trying to disciple everyone and disciple no one. We must become comfortable with discipleship or disciple-making process that identifies the hungry and unashamedly feeds them. That's a hard thing for us to do. Is that making sense? I know it's a little after lunch, we're a little tired. But, we're not used to that. We're not used to that. There's nothing more frustrating than having a desire to engage in the organizational culture not be equipped to satisfy that desire. How many of you, work and you're frustrated because you want to learn more and you want to do more at work, but there's no mechanism for you to go there. That's one of the things. I went to an interview for UPS. I did not know this until I went to an interview with them. Do you know they do not hire anyone from outside? They do not hire. Every person that is promoted from within. Isn't that right? What, sir? They do not hire from outside. They develop from the bottom. So the person that's in charge, one time moved boxes on the floor. And so that's how there is a mechanism. They have a plan that will move them from one place to the other. And quite honestly, they have a very high employee satisfaction rate because there is a mechanism that moves them. The sad thing of it is this is what I believe. I believe that the business world walked into the Bible and took all the discipleship plans out and made it theirs, and then the churches looked to the business world going, oh wow, look at this, let's implement this, let's mimic them, let's copy them, when in fact we've had the structure all along.
Amen.
And so that's most important. And I think sometimes when we look at a discipleship making, we're looking for that program. Please hand me a program. Well, truthfully, and I'll talk about it just a little bit, you can't be in a program because a program can never really tell you how people are going to respond. One of the things I loved about being a firefighter is for 21 years and the thousands and thousands and thousands of calls I went on, it was never the same. Why? Because people aren't the same.
Amen.
And so to try to get a program, now I'm not saying you can't have principles and concepts, but to try to get a program that somebody developed and just instill it in your church rarely works. Because there's still got to be a personal element that has to take place. And so incorporated into the discipleship making strategy must be even a time for more intimate setting that provides an opportunity to go a little deeper. Matthew 24:3 says, now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and at the end of the age? So again, we see here when we talk about going from the crowd to a smaller environment, even in this particular setting, the disciples come to the Lord after he had just expounded to the crowd, and they needed further explanation. There was a place for them to go. They could go to the Lord. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves is, in our church, where can our new converts go? Where can the saints of age go to find direction, to find explanation? And so, again, this is a process these are some concepts that we need to think about. Luke 11:1. Now it came to pass, he was praying in a certain place, and we see this as Jesus praying. And when he ceased, that one of his disciples said unto him, Lord, teach us to pray, as John also taught his disciples. So you see from the crowd, and then there's the next thing that we see is there's a smaller environment that again is where questions can be asked, and this is where the disciples learn to pray. I try not to use a whole lot of personal stories, but I'm teaching a Bible study. I'm 2 lessons in. I'm so excited. We're going to baptize him on Sunday, and he looked at me. It's exciting. But on this past week we're talking, and we're in the second lesson, and we're talking about the fall and of man and Noah's Ark. And after I'm all done, he stops and he goes, I'm going to ask you a question, and it's probably off the beaten path. Okay, I'm fine with that.
Right.
You know what his question was? How do I pray? This by his own admission, he's never been in a church. Prayer's like breathing for me. I'm not being dramatic, but
right.
It is. It's part of my life. I've been in this all my life. And I'm sitting there listening to a guy that has never had a conversation with the Lord.
Jesus. Hallelujah.
But the beauty of it is,
come on now.
he'd have never got to express that in a large gathering.
Right.
Church services, he hears people pray.
Right.
We've got pre-service prayer. We're prayerful church, just like you are. Why didn't he catch it? Why didn't he get it with just the church service and the pre-service prayer? But in a smaller environment, he says to me, "Hey, how do I pray?" So we went down that road and we taught him how to pray. So here's a gentleman that's been coming to church for a little bit, and I don't know that there was frustration, but literally he watched everybody pray, and he didn't know how to pray. And so if we're not careful, we'll think, especially us that it's just been who we are for all of our lives,
Right.
We'll take for granted that people understand that.
Right. You're right.
We'll take for granted that they catch that in a service. Well, didn't you hear the people praying? Didn't you hear the person next to you praying? But they did. He saw what was going on. He recognized what was going on, but he didn't know how to do it himself. And so that smaller environment really helps us to solidify some things in their lives. And again, and we talk about discipleship. We don't want to make a mistake of just thinking it's new converts. It's for our continued growth. And so even in leadership, there must be opportunities to be able to have the smaller environment. Again, I'm not here to tell you how it's accomplished. Perhaps some churches are in small groups. Some churches may accomplish it in Sunday school classes. It's a smaller setting where you can ask questions. And I know in our church, we're not extremely large, but in our church on Thursday nights, sometimes it gets pretty interactive and people can ask questions, and we exchange ideas and things of that nature during the teaching session. So that's an opportunity as well. Oftentimes, from these, even a smaller setting where there are one or two will reveal that they want to go deeper. So in this smaller class, there will be a couple that will even want to go deeper, and so we'll have to think about that as well. Mark 5:22 begins a story about Jairus' daughter who is dying, and he summons Jesus to come to his house and heal his daughter. And so I understand one of the things that we're talking about here is there's a group that will go to the big crowd, then there's a smaller crowd. Now there's a crowd that kind of wants to get close. Now there's a crowd that wants to really go a bit deeper. And I'm not opposed to those that are in the crowd. I'm not opposed to those that want to stop at the other level. And that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is providing for every level of hunger that someone wants to go to. And so I love this story. And so in Mark 5:37-41, talking about disciple making, he says, "And he suffered no man to follow him." This is Jesus, save Peter and James and John, the brother of James. "And he cometh to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and seeth the tumult, and them that wept and wailed greatly. And when he was come in, he saith unto them, Why make ye this ado, and weep? The damsel is not dead, but sleepeth. And they laughed him to scorn," talking about Jesus. "But when he had put them all out, he taketh the father and the mother of the damsel, and them that were with him," keep in mind this is Peter and James, "and he entered in where the damsel was lying, and he took the damsel by hand and said unto her," I'm not going to even try that, which is being interpreted, "Damsel, I say unto thee, arise." Talitha, and which is being interpreted, "Damsel, I say unto thee, arise." Here's the point I'm trying to make. Take a look at Acts, the 9th chapter, verse 36. This is at Joppa. There was a certain disciple named Tabitha, which was translated Dorcas, and the woman was full of good works and charitable deeds, and which she did. But it happened in those days that she became sick and died. And when they had washed her, they laid her in the upper room. And since Lydia was near Joppa, and the disciples had heard that Peter was there, they sent 2 men to him, imploring him not to delay in coming to them. Then Peter arose and went with them, and when they had come, they brought him to the upper room, and all the widows stood by weeping, showing the tunics and garments which Dorcas had made while she was with them. But Peter put them all out. Where do we see that? And knelt down and prayed, and turning to the body, he said, Tabitha, arise. And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. What did Peter do? What did Peter do? Where did he learn it from? Jesus. In Mark, Jesus takes Peter, he goes up to a similar situation, he puts everybody out. Now we're talking about that next level. Now we're talking about somebody that wants to come, there's going to be those that they're going to come alongside of us, and we're going to have to, Paul said, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And so this is so cool to me that now Peter is just simply, now he's faced with the same situation. What does he do? He does what the Lord showed him to do. And in fact, follows the model very completely. How did he learn that? Because he was in a position where he was hungry, and he went a little deeper, and the Lord understood his hunger, and the Lord and Jesus showed him and took him with him.
Amen.
And so he demonstrated how this should be done. He took opportunity to show him. He could have put him out, but he let him come in. Now he's faced with the same situation. He just simply does what was modeled before him. So when we begin to talk about that, there has to be an opportunity. And I know we're talking about this, as you're saying, I know we're all busy. But when we really want to make disciples and they're hungry, they're there and they're going to be hungry, you're going to have to let them come alongside of you. There's going to have to be some kind of place in the discipleship making process where those that want to go to a depth that you allow them to come alongside of you.
Yes.
I'm sorry, you had a
I was going to say, and it's just so funny that this story is, talking about Peter. Peter was actually one of the 3 that Jesus did a lot of stuff with.
Yeah.
The mountain, when he sent everybody else, it was only 3 people, including Peter, was the only ones that Jesus kind of really had that intimate relationship with. Because he knew who he wanted to do what he was going to do later on.
And you grab the process. There was the large crowd. Then there was the 12. And then there was the 3. Quite honestly, Jesus' discipleship model, there it is. The large crowd, feed the hungry, develop the hunger, if you can say it that way. And again, even in John 13, after washing the disciples' feet, Jesus said, I have given you an example that you should do as I have done unto you. Again, modeling, mentoring, must be incorporated into our discipleship process. Again, Paul said, imitate. He's dealing with some issues in the church and some questions in the church. And he says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Obviously, he had poured into them. So again, when we talk about discipleship, the making of disciples, there are going to be different levels. And we've got to be okay with that. Some will want to stay at the surface level. Okay, we take time and we do what we can, and then there are those that are going to, there's going to be the 12 and that smaller group, and we work with them, and then we're going to be able to finally get to the place that there's going to be those that are going to want to come close and duplicate what you're doing, and that's the mark of it. We know there's nothing more satisfying when you have worked and you've discipled someone, and then you now see them going and discipling someone else. They've come down through that model, and however they arrived there, I tend to believe that most people that are, shall I say, most people can identify that are disciples, can identify who's discipling them, as we talked about earlier, and who they're discipling. I can tell you who's pouring into me, and I can tell you who I'm pouring into. Well, you're a pastor. I'm still being poured into. I'm still learning. I'm still growing. But the process for me, one of the thing that has helped me the most is that I've learned by observing and I've learned by coming next to people. That's been most effective for me. And I think that's oftentimes most effective for everyone. Brother Flores was sharing with me how his original pastor took him in and how he got to spend time with him. And so why? He was hungry. He saw that. He realized that. He worked with him. And so I'm hesitant to give you just a program, but I think you see the structure that, in fact, the Lord put in place. He ministered to the crowd. There was an identified, and he called some, they responded. And so he worked with them, and then there was a smaller group that he worked with and modeled. And quite honestly, going back to Peter, who stood up on the day of Pentecost. And so we see that. As I said, the Apostle Paul understood the importance of mentoring when he said, "Be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ." Follower means imitator. Paul addressed some questions by telling them to look at him as a mentor. Why? Because he was following Christ. A couple things, and then we'll call it. I know you all are tired and want to get out of here. Well, just a couple things. When we talk about a process, reevaluating the process, the discipleship making process will not always produce disciples. Somewhere along the line, from the large group, right, somewhere along the line in the discipleship process, it's not always going to produce. This may not be a flaw in the process, but reveal the heart of the disciple. Yeah. The reason I felt to bring that out is because I think sometimes we look and we're not getting the results that we want, and we say, well, let's scrap this whole discipleship thing. Let's go in another direction. Right. That's a dangerous way to go. Yes, sir. Because now you're letting the crowd dictate where you want to go. Right. And so it's not. We don't always have to reevaluate the process. Now, there are times, the key indicator, if the disciple-making process, if it's flawed, is that the hungry are starving because the process is limited in depth. And if we're being honest with ourselves, but oftentimes the disciple comes to the point where commitment is too great. We talked about the profile of a disciple. John 6:66. From that time, many of his disciples went back and walked no more with him. Right. And so we understand that the process, it's not always going to produce, and that shouldn't be a level of frustration for us as long as we are paying attention. What did we talk about earlier? The principles. So when we look at what does a discipleship look like? We went over those principles, that profile that Jesus set up of what a disciple looks like. If we're again reevaluating that, and that's the end goal, that's fine. But not everybody is going to indeed measure up or become a disciple. And here's the thing. This is the reason why the discipleship landscape is out of kilter. Because churches begin to look at the people and say, oh no, we're doing something wrong. And so they change the process, or they change the biblical process for making disciples. Brother Sistrom said it. It's a process. It takes time. We don't want time. Time. To us, time is not good. It's an enemy. But the reality of it is, if we're going to have to understand that this discipleship model, it's got to be in place. It's got to run its course, and not everybody's going to respond. But if there is a group that is responding, that's coming alongside of you, and fruit is being produced, then the process that you've installed is good, and it's working. And again, we talk about, I didn't mention it this morning, but I want to talk about it before we get done. Discipleship, and the discipleship, making disciples is messy. Yeah. We talked about the cost of a disciple today following Jesus. Being involved in discipleship or making disciples is intense too. I was telling you about the gentleman that earlier that I talked with, and he spent I started mentoring him that didn't know the language of the church, and I spent probably, we've known each other 20 years and I'm still discipling him. There's been a lot of ups and downs.
Right.
I spent a year and a half discipling him, and he called me up one day. He wanted to meet on the back of my truck, and so we're talking on the back of my truck, and he looks at me and he goes, "I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to live this way anymore." He said, "Is that okay?" Now, in my heart, I was crushed.
Yeah.
Discipleship makes it tough.
Yeah. Amen.
Man, you've been in my house 2 nights a week, sometimes at least 1 night a week every week for the last couple of years. I've given up countless family things so that I can go and disciple and all of those things. I'm not saying look at me. I just want us to understand that the process is going to cost.
Good.
So here's the thing. He asked me, he said, "Will you still be my friend?" Well, absolutely, I'll be your friend. He never missed a service. He just decided, man, but it's messy. People are messy. We look at the Good Samaritan. Again, it's messy. You're going to have to get your hands dirty. You're going to have to get involved in their lives, and so again, that's not something that a program or a curriculum can teach. That's something that prayer develops.
Amen.
That's something that the Holy Ghost develops within you that helps you recognize there's a Brother Flores in your group and you want to bring him in a little closer.
Right.
That's what Jesus did. He called. He called them. And so, I'm sorry. Brother Walter, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say that the other way of handling that would have been, and I've heard this happen unfortunately, it's like, you're going to get the Holy Ghost in my church and you're going to leave like that. You know what I mean? And it questions people. And it just, to me, I heard this aspect of it today, which is awesome. Which by you saying that, and I'm kind of asking that question, by you saying that, yes, I'll still be a friend, was that what triggered it for him to never leave?
Yes, that is what triggered it. But the other thing of it is when we have that crisis in discipleship making, and you get offended, or I get offended, that's a wrong attitude. Something needs to be checked in here. I couldn't conceive of not being his friend anymore. Was I hurt? Oh, I was hurt. I was dying inside.
Right.
I was hurt. But I couldn't show him. And I smiled. And he did tell me. Several months later, he told me, he said, I came to you and I was sure you were going to tell me you didn't like me, you wouldn't be my friend anymore because you've invested so much in me. And the minute you said you weren't going to be my friend anymore, I was out of your church. I was done, not you. He said, my church is not my church, we understand that. But if I would allow myself to be caught up in the crisis, I would have said something wrong. I would have acted wrong. But again, we have to, I tell folks a lot, hurt people. Yes.
Oh yeah.
And what I mean by that is when we start to disciple folks, they're just growing.
Right.
And we're starting to give them principles that are shattering their worlds a little bit and changing their worlds, and sometimes they get a little defensive and they lash out and they get a little ugly, and so, but if we learn, wait a minute, that's just the process of them growth. Does that make sense? And if it goes back to that disciple, if we can love them, and that's, one display that day was love. Really, I really wasn't upset, but it was love, and that's what caused them. So discipleship making can be a little bit. It can be costly. You're going to have to roll your sleeves up, get dirty, and willing, and people will know the minute you're no longer vested in them. And so we again, just some food for thought there. It takes some commitment, and and if we're going to start, there's nothing worse than starting the process and then, start making disciples and then we don't follow through because it gets a little messy, because it gets a little ugly, because they're getting a little, gets a little uncomfortable. Jesus gave us that example where he went and met with the folks that, the prostitutes. He went and met with the folks that were sinners. And so we also have to understand that these folks are hurting and that, we never want to drop or stop the process. We want to continue. We don't want to. Does that make sense? We've got to stay invested because it's going to cost. And if you're going to get into discipleship making, you need to count the cost. You need to make sure that you're willing to pay the price that it's going to cost you. But there's nothing better than seeing that person you disciple turn around and start discipling others.
Amen.
That's just a great, great feeling. And so, again, I know it's getting a little, I think I got to 3:30. While I'm not providing a specific curriculum for making disciples, I hope I've, again, provided a few principles to consider if you're thinking about establishing a discipleship making process, or a few points that you will consider the next time you reevaluate that process. So, again, thank you for coming today. I hope I've said something that's been helpful. Any questions or comments? Yes, sir.
I have a question. As far as when you are, I've had probably a very few people that have really taken off. They're getting hungry and they've done, now they're doing Bible study, which is awesome. But there's also people like recently where I've seen them get the Holy Ghost Bible study, and then they just one of the things we were praying for with this gentleman was a job. He got an awesome job, and then he just kind of disappeared. At what point do you let them go? You stop pursuing them? At what point, do you just, maybe that's a trick question, or that there's an art to that. But,
well, truthfully, when they stop wanting to be discipled.
Yeah.
When they walked away from Jesus, when the loaves and the fish, and it's hurtful. It's you're hurt, especially because you care and you love them. But it's going to happen. It's going to happen. I have to do that by prayer. I have to do that by feel, really. And they're not, it doesn't mean I cut off all contact, but if they're starting to resist me, then I'm just kind of like, okay, and I may give it a little bit, let it rest. And I found sometimes if I let it rest for a minute and then come back, sometimes it's giving them a chance to think. Sometimes we just need to know what's going on in the background.
Amen.
I've found times where family has been giving them a hard time, so they backed off a little bit, and I've just kind of not backed off completely, but just tactically going at it a different way. And a few months later, it clicks, and we're back up and running. So it's kind of hard. That's why it's really hard to give a specific program. I think it's going to be done. When you start getting in, that's why it gets messy, because you're going to have situations like that, and they're hard. But if we flow with the Holy Ghost, I believe the Holy Ghost is really going to give us an understanding of how to handle the situation. Anybody else?
I had something on the same lines as Monday. Did I cut some off?
No.
I had something kind of on the same line. What I called him a young man. He came out and he got way back when he was a little boy. I got him at like in his 30s, and him and his wife never came. He came faithfully. Got in ministry, started helping in music and sound. Usher. He was wanting to be a part of everything after he was raised in the church, and then when you come back to the Lord, you just want to serve. You want to do everything you can for the Lord because you're appreciative of coming back. He kept saying, "Pastor, I just want my wife to be saved. I just want my wife to be saved." She said she's going to, but you just got to pray for her. And I don't know what happened, but after his wife came to the Lord, he just walked away. lasted about a year without that spiritual support. And it does it. You know, you kind of go, what in the world? You know, what is this? You prayed for a miracle happened, your wife is saved, now your wife is in church. How do you know what I mean? And the question that you asked was, when do you stop? Well, you know, I didn't do it every week. I was hitting it every other week and just say, praying for you, brother, checking on you, send texts. Yeah. Wouldn't get no replies. So I went probably 2-3 months doing it, and when you don't get no response, I tell you, that's you know, I mean, you don't have to be.
It's the indicator.
Yes, it is. It's an indicator that they're not interested in replying. And so my last text was, I love you, and if there's anything I can ever do for you, please don't hesitate to call. So, was it emotionally hurtful? Yes. But you can't make nobody serve God. It's a choice. Everything they do is a choice. And some people get a blessing and forget where that blessing comes from.
Yeah.
And they forget there was a fleece or a covenant made.
Yeah.
Right? And they forget about that covenant or that fleece they put, and it happens, and then the devil creeps in, and if they don't keep their spiritual life right, it's easy for them to fall into where they do.
Yeah, I have several experiences with people that if we aren't sure that they are disciples, we just invest so much time on them, and the longer we keep them in church, trying to beg them to stay, the more damage they create in the church. So I have a couple that they threatened me for a year to leave me, and I just try to do everything to keep them in church. So finally, when they leave, they just drag so many people with them. Wow. The next time that happens, I say, when I love you, when I miss you, go with God.
And here's the thing. The very process that we're talking about is going to reveal the quality of the heart.
That's right.
Yes. Yes.
Amen.
The sifting. You know, we can invoke this process, and it's just it's not everybody's going to respond. But we got to be careful not to become frustrated. Because if we become frustrated, we kind of lose that love, and we forget that there's others that indeed are responding. We become cynical, critical, and we certainly don't need that. Yes, sir.
And then you gotta realize when Jesus was teaching and people were leaving, he asked the disciples, he said, "Are you going to leave?" But then he turned around and told them, "Y'all going to scatter from me when I get crucified." So it's like it's like I think Jesus knows that under certain circumstances people are going to leave. But it's where they at is determines on where they're going to return back to when they come. See, he had discipled them so long that he knew they was going to scatter, but he knew eventually they was going to come back. So I think sometimes it's more like if you install more into them. I mean, like I said, I grew up in the church. I went out of the church. I went to other churches. But I knew my foundation in the apostolic was so firm, like I couldn't survive out there. I was like, man, like I was telling me and Pastor Allen was just talking, I was like, man, you go to other churches and you hear what they be teaching. I was like, man, this is wrong. I'm like, I can't sit up in this mess. I'm like, man, look, I got kicked out of churches because I done preached. They done talk about Romans 10 and 9. I done preached Acts 2:38. They was like, man, you got to go. I'm like, it is just like sometimes like you just like you turn around and you just leave and then you turn around and come back. I mean, sometimes it's like that boom. It's always going to have that boomerang effect, and that's what I learned about discipleship. Will have a boomerang effect because people have to go through something in order to know how good or what they have.
Amen.
And that's where I realized, growing up apostolic, going outside of apostolic, I realized how good I already am.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I'll say something, this is kind of humorous, but it's so true. We had a couple of new converts in our church in West Oklahoma, Texas, and they decided they were going to go to the other church because we were just too boring. There was nothing in the church. They started assisting the other church, maybe 3 or 4 services, they came back, and they said, man, that church is dead. Bigger crowd, recording band and whatnot, and they came back, and they, Martin, he apologized. He said, man, the Holy Ghost is in this place.
Yeah.
That's
the difference.
And I said,
chill, man.
praise God. I was so proud of the church after that, after of the Lord, right?
Yeah.
The confidence boosted us. But yeah, they know where it's at. If they want it, they'll come back to us.
Some was not a message for nothing.
Yes, ma'am.
No, I was just gonna say, I think ultimately we really just need to take our personal emotions out of it, because at the end of the day, they're truly rejecting God. But the minute that revelation comes to them, a true revelation, they're gonna come back and we have to welcome them with open arms, no matter what. So,
At the end of the day, discipleship making process is really about loving people.
Amen. Amen.
It's really about loving people. And it's to love people is going to cost us a little bit. We're going to have to get close. We're going to have to mentor and those type of things. And so again, thank you for coming. I hope you're blessed.
This is good.